Hi, this is Angela with Cooley Environmental Safety Training, and this is a presentation we put together on the new Respirable Crystalline Silica rule, and just summarizing basically some of the changes you can expect when the rule goes into effect at the end of the year. The Division of Occupational Safety and Health, DOSH, is in the process of creating the Respirable Crystalline Silica rule, which will be WAC 296-840. This rule will bring Washington State into compliance with OSHA's Respirable Silica rules for construction and general industry that went into effect June 16, 2016. At this time, the requirements in the DOSH Respirable Crystalline Silica rule are going to be identical to those in OSHA's rules. The following contains a breakdown of DOSH's draft Respirable Crystalline Silica rule. A complete version of the draft rule is available on Cooley Environmental Safety Training's website. So what is respirable crystalline silica? Crystalline silica is a common mineral found in many naturally occurring materials and is used in many industrial products and at construction sites. Washington State defines respirable crystalline silica as quartz, cristobalite, and/or tridymite contained in airborne particles that are determined to be respirable by a sampling device designed to meet the characteristics for respirable particle size selectiveness. Typically, particles that are 10 microns in diameter or smaller are going to be considered respirable particles. Inhaling very small crystalline silica particles has been linked to multiple diseases. Probably the disease most associated with silica exposure is silicosis, which is an incurable lung disease that can lead to disability and death. Respirable crystalline silica can also cause lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, and has also been linked to kidney disease. Materials like sand, concrete, stone, and mortar contain crystalline silica. Crystalline silica is also used to make products such as glass, pottery, ceramics, bricks, concrete, and artificial stone. Industrial sands that are used in certain operations, such as foundry work and in the fracking industry, are also sources of crystalline silica exposure. Amorphous silica, such as silica gel, is not crystalline silica and therefore does not need to be managed under these rules. Additionally, being near sand or other silica-containing materials is not hazardous. Respirable crystalline silica particles are typically at least 100 times smaller than ordinary sand found on beaches or in playgrounds. Activities such as abrasive blasting with sand, sawing brick or concrete, sanding or drilling into brick and concrete, grinding mortar, manufacturing brick or concrete blocks, and cutting or crushing stone will generate respirable dust particles. OSHA set their new permissible exposure limits, or PEL, for workers at 50 micrograms of respirable crystalline silica per cubic meter of air, which is averaged over an 8-hour day. This level is the same for all workplaces covered by the rule, so it's the same for general industry, shipyards, and in construction sites. The new PEL is roughly about 50% of OSHA's previous PEL for general industry and about 20% of the previous PEL for construction and shipyards. Additionally, OSHA established an action level for respirable crystalline silica at 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air, averaged over an 8-hour day. Washington State is adopting the same 50 micrograms per cubic meter permissible exposure limit, as well as the 25 microgram per cubic meter action level. The new PEL will consolidate the different respirable crystalline silica PELs Washington State currently has. The state's current PEL for silica crystalline cristobalite and crystalline tridymite is 50 micrograms per cubic meter, while the current PEL for silica crystalline quartz and crystalline tripolyas quartz is 100 micrograms per cubic meter. However, as mentioned above, if workers will be exposed to just 25 micrograms per cubic meter of respirable crystalline silica averaged over an 8-hour day, the employer will have to implement portions of this new rule as well. To put this into perspective, 1 microgram is equal to 1/1,000,000th of a gram. The new rule will become effective on December 31st, 2017, and the timeline for the implementation of the rule is going to depend on the industry. In the construction industry, employers must comply with the rule by December 31st, 2018. However, employers have until December 31st, 2019 to complete the sample analysis requirements within the new rule. For all other occupational exposures to respirable crystalline silica, employers must comply with the new rule by December 31st, 2019. Again, there are some exceptions. So where employees will be exposed to respirable crystalline silica at or above the 50 microgram per cubic meter PEL for 30 or more days per year, the medical requirements in the rule must be in effect or brought into compliance by December 31st, 2019. Where employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica is at or above the action level for 30 or more days per year, the medical surveillance requirements within the new rule must be completed by December 31st, 2021. Now, for the oil and gas industry, there are some engineering controls that they must start to engage in to prevent exposure to crystalline silica, and those must be implemented by December 31st, 2022. Under the new rule, employers must assess the exposure of each employee who is or may reasonably be expected to be exposed to respirable crystalline silica at or above the action level. This exposure assessment must measure the amount of respirable crystalline silica each employee is exposed to over an 8-hour day. The employer can use any combination of air monitoring data sufficient to accurately characterize employee exposures. All samples taken to satisfy the monitoring requirements of the rule must be evaluated by a laboratory that analyzes air samples for respirable crystalline silica in accordance to the procedures in Appendix A of the regulations. Remember, your sample analysis for the exposure assessment must be completed by December 31st, 2019. Employers must also reassess employee exposure whenever there is a change in the workplace or work practices that may reasonably be expected to result in a new or additional exposure at or above the action level. This section in the regulations also spells out the employer's responsibility to notify employees of the assessment results and the requirement to provide exposed employees with the corrective actions that are being taken to reduce their exposure. Within the new rule, there is a table that lays out the required engineering controls that must be in place for specific workplace activities that are known to create respirable crystalline silica dust, and if respiratory protection is also going to be required when performing these tasks. A full version, again, of this rule is available at Cooley Environmental Safety Training's website, and within that new rule you can find the complete version of this Table 1. Basically, the table works in that it identifies in the first column specific tasks that people can perform and equipment they may use when performing those tasks. Then in the second column, it lays out the engineering and work practice control methods that the employer must use when these tasks are being performed. And then in the last column, it's going to state whether or not respiratory protection is also going to be required in addition to the engineering and work practice controls, and if it is, what level of protection that respirator needs to provide. This is just a short version of the table. There's a number of different tasks and equipment laid out within it. However, if an employer can show that their employees will not be exposed to respirable crystalline silica above the permissible exposure limits while doing the activities laid out in this table, they are not required to implement the different engineering and work practice control methods. If areas had been identified where activities or processes generate respirable crystalline silica dust at or above the PEL, employers must regulate access to those areas. Employers must mark off these areas with signs at all entrances from the rest of the workplace and limit access to only employees who are required by their work duties to be in that area. Where a regulated area is established, employers must post signs at all the entrances to that area which read, "Danger, respirable crystalline silica may cause cancer, causes damage to lungs, wear respiratory protection in this area, authorized personnel only." The employers are going to be required to provide employees who work in these areas with an appropriate respirator. As mentioned previously, employers must use engineering and work practice controls to reduce employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica to levels at or below the PEL, unless the employer can demonstrate such controls are just not feasible. Even if engineering and work practice controls are not sufficient to reduce employee exposure to below the PEL, employers still must use them to reduce employee exposure to the lowest feasible level, and then they must supplement with the use of respiratory protection that is in compliance with the new rule. While respirators cannot be used as the primary method to control exposure to respirable crystalline silica, respirators at times may be required and can be used as a sole source in some instances to protect workers from respirable crystalline silica. So examples can be where exposures to respirable crystalline silica dust are going to exceed the PEL during periods necessary to install or implement various feasible engineering and workplace practice controls, where exposure exceeds the PEL during tasks such as a maintenance or repair work for which engineering and work practice controls are not feasible, during tasks for which an employer has implemented all feasible engineering and work practice controls, but exposures are still above the permissible exposure limits, during periods when employees are in regulated areas, and anywhere specified in Table 1 for tasks performed according to the requirements within the new rule. The new rule also has some strict housekeeping rules employers must follow. Employers must not allow dry sweeping or dry brushing if these activities could contribute to employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica. That is, unless the more effective wet sweeping or HEPA-filtered vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood of exposure are not feasible. Additionally, employers must not allow compressed air to be used to clean clothing or surfaces when these activities could contribute to employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica. Again, there are some exceptions, such as when compressed air is used in conjunction with a ventilation system that is effective at capturing the dust created, or you can show that there's no alternative method available. If respirable crystalline silica is present in the workplace at or above the PEL, the new rule requires employers to establish and implement a written exposure control plan. The exposure control plan must contain a description of the tasks that lead to exposure to respirable crystalline silica. Then it must describe the engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection used to limit employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica for each of these tasks. And lastly, a description of the housekeeping measures used to limit employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica. The employer must review and evaluate the effectiveness of the written exposure control plan at least once each year and update it as necessary. The plan must be available to each employee who could be affected by respirable crystalline exposure on their job. The written exposure plan for construction work activity must include all of the items above and a description of the procedures used to restrict access to the work area when necessary. Also, to minimize the number of employees exposed to respirable crystalline silica, and it must contain details on the worker's level of exposure, including exposures generated by other employers they may work for, or if they're sole proprietors on jobs that they do on their own. Lastly, it must state that a competent person will be present to make frequent and regular inspections of job sites to make sure materials and equipment needed to implement the written control plan are present. Employers must initiate a medical surveillance program if they have employees who are going to meet either of these two conditions. The first condition is that they are doing construction tasks and are going to be required to use a respirator for 30 or more days per year to protect them from respirable crystalline silica exposure. Or if in every other industry, if employees are doing work that will have them exposed to respirable crystalline silica on the job at or above the action level for 30 or more days per year. Employees who meet those two conditions must have a medical examination before they continue working in those areas. And the medical examination will consist of a medical and work history with emphasis on past, present, and anticipated exposure to respirable crystalline silica, dusts, and other agents that can affect their respiratory system. They will collect, the medical professional will collect any history of any kind of respiratory system dysfunction the employee may have, including signs and symptoms of respiratory disease, and they will also get information on if they are a smoker or have been a smoker in the past. Another unique portion of this medical examination is that as part of it, employees must complete the adult tuberculosis risk assessment for workers exposed to respirable crystalline silica. This is a form that L&I has put together that assesses the possibility of a worker having been exposed to tuberculosis in the past. Again, part of the medical examination will be a physical with special emphasis on the respiratory system, so a chest x-ray, measure of pulmonary function, and also testing for any latent tuberculosis infection. If respirable crystalline silica is present in the workplace, it must be added to your hazard communication program. Employees must be aware that exposure to respirable crystalline silica can lead to cancer, lung effects, immune system effects, and damage to their kidneys. Employees covered under the new respirable crystalline silica rule must be able to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of at least the following: the health hazards associated with the exposure to respirable crystalline silica, specific tasks in the workplace that could result in exposure to respirable crystalline silica, specific measures their employers have implemented to protect them from exposure to respirable crystalline silica, including engineering controls, work practices, and respirators they may need to use. They need to be familiar with the rule itself, and they have to understand the purpose and the description of the medical surveillance program that is required within the new rule. And if they work in construction, they need to be able to identify the competent person who has been designated by their employer. This is kind of a level of competency that's on par with workers who have to work around asbestos or lead in the workplace as well. Employers must make and maintain accurate records of all exposure to measurements, must maintain accurate record of all exposure measurements taken to assess employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica. Likewise, the employer must make and maintain an accurate record for each employee covered by the medical surveillance portion of the new rule. And these records must be held on file for at least 30 years after the employee has left their employer. The goal of the new rule is to protect the health of all the approximately 2.3 million workers who are exposed to respirable crystalline silica in their workplace. Respirable crystalline silica has been identified as a workplace hazard since the 1930s, and while there has been a standard in place since 1971, it has not been updated until now. OSHA estimates that the new rule will save over 600 lives and prevent more than 900 new cases of silicosis each year once its effects are fully realized. While on the national level the rule change has dramatically lowered PELs, in particular for construction, it does not have as dramatic an impact on employers in Washington state. As mentioned earlier, there were two different PELs for respirable crystalline silica, 100 micrograms per cubic meter, and one that was at 50 micrograms per cubic meter. And the new rule is going to combine them into one at the lower PEL. The greatest changes for employers in Washington state are the requirement for specific engineering controls and workplace practices, and the increase in the administrative requirements, such as having to create regulated areas, the stricter housekeeping rules, the requirement for a written exposure and control plan, the requirement that employees are able to demonstrate their knowledge of respirable crystalline silica, and the requirements of the medical evaluation as well. Becoming compliant with the new regulation is certainly not an impossible task. However, it will require employers to devote time and energies to bring their programs in line with the new rule. Cooley Environmental Safety Training would be pleased to assist you in bringing your current program into compliance or to help you create a respirable crystalline silica control program. Please contact us if you would like to discuss how the rule change may affect your workplace or if you have any questions about anything discussed in this presentation. Thank you for your time.